The first thing Harry knew when he opened his eyes was that silence had a body of its own. It lay across the great hall like another fallen giant, heavy and cold and impossible to shift. Somewhere inside it a witch was weeping with the patient, used-up sound of someone who had cried all night and had forgotten how to stop. Somewhere else crockery scraped over stone, and from very far away came the faint thunder of collapsing masonry, where spells still worked their way loose in the wounded castle. But under all of that was the silence, pressing against the ears, pressing against the ribs, filling the lungs with the ash-sour taste of what had been paid for victory. Harry pushed himself upright on aching arms. His scar did not hurt. That, more than anything, felt wrong. For years, pain had been the herald of danger, the tolling bell before the storm. Now there was only the ordinary pain of bruises, split knuckles, stiff shoulders, a burn along one wrist, a dull pounding in his skull. He had thought, while he was still falling upward through the strange brightness of the forest, that if he ever came back into his body, the world would feel new. It did not. It felt old and broken and unbearably dear. Ginny was asleep against a toppled bench a few feet away, one hand still half-curled as if she had gone under in the middle of reaching for someone. Her hair, dulled with soot, blazed all the same where dawn touched it through the ruined windows. Ron lay sprawled nearby with his mouth open, one trainer half off his foot, his face gray with exhaustion. Hermione had made a pillow of her folded robes and slept on her side with her hand tucked under her cheek, the way she had sometimes done in the tent, as if even unconscious she expected to be woken and told they must move on at once. All around them, the great hall had become a place too full of meanings to bear. Healers moved quietly among the living. The dead had been gathered with a tenderness that made the throat ache, covered faces, straightened limbs, hands folded if hands could still be folded. Minerva, her tartan dressing gown gone, her emerald robes scorched at one cuff, strode from body to body and survivor to survivor, with the rigid poise of someone who understood that if she allowed herself 1 second of collapse, the whole castle might follow her down. Beside her, Kingsley moved with a different gravity, less the sharp authority of a headmistress, more the deep, grim steadiness of a man who had already begun taking stock of a shattered government, while the dust still hung in the air. Harry's gaze snagged, helpless and unwilling, on too many familiar outlines. A broad shoulder under a sheet, a hand he knew by the freckles, a shock of hair not unlike his own. He looked away so quickly his vision blurred. He got to his feet. His legs were shaky and the room seemed to tilt before righting itself. Neville was across the hall speaking in a raw, tired murmur to Hannah Abbott, who had her apron smeared with blood and dittany. Dean and Seamus were levitating broken benches aside to clear space for stretchers. Hagrid sat on the floor with his back against a pillar, enormous hands hanging uselessly between his knees, crying into a handkerchief that looked pitifully small. 100 eyes had looked at Harry like that before, in amazement, curiosity, fear, hope. But never with quite this terrible fullness, as if every face were saying the same thing, and none of them could bear to put it into words. He could not endure it. He slipped past the nearest tables, ducked a floating splinter of wood that had not yet quite decided to stop obeying the last charm cast upon it, and found a gap where an oak door had been blown half off its hinges. Outside, the grounds were pearled with a thin, early mist. Dawn spread over the lawns and broken battlements in a color too gentle for the night that had just ended. The air smelled of lake water and wet grass beneath the smoke. For one dizzy second, the beauty of it struck him with such force that he felt angry, as though the morning had insulted the dead simply by arriving. He stood on the steps, breathing, while below him survivors and teachers moved across the grounds like figures in some ancient tapestry half-burnt at the edges. A team of centaurs was already dragging away fallen masonry with ropes. Near the greenhouses, Professor Sprout knelt in the mud with her hands over a broken patch of earth, coaxing roots back to life. The castle had not surrendered. It was rebuilding itself from pain because that was the only work left. "You ought to sit down before you fall down," Kingsley said. Harry turned. Kingsley had come up beside him without sound. His dark robes were scorched at the hem. There was dried blood on one temple, not all of it his. He looked like a man carved from exhausted oak. "I'm all right," Harry said automatically. Kingsley's mouth moved very slightly. "No one in Britain is all right this morning, and I distrust anyone who claims otherwise." For a moment they stood shoulder to shoulder looking at the grounds. Below, someone shouted for bandages. A flock of black-robed figures crossed the lawn toward the gates, carrying stretchers between them. "It's done," Harry said, though he did not know whether he meant it as question or statement. "The battle is done," Kingsley answered. "Battles are the clean part, if such things can be called clean. They begin, they end, and by the end one knows who is standing. What follows is murkier." Harry glanced at him. "You mean the ministry?" "I mean everything." Kingsley folded his arms. "The ministry. Azkaban.c. Trials. Compromised officials. Missing wand permits. Families who awake this morning to find a son or brother has vanished rather than answer for what he did. The kind of fear that comes when people have been terrorized too long and do not know what comes after terror." Nay. Harry wanted to protest that none of it was his business, that he had done enough, that he had earned one day, 1 hour, of being nothing to anyone but a tired boy on the castle steps. But even as the thought rose, he watched 3 hooded figures hurry beyond the gates toward the road, and one of them turned his face away too sharply when he saw Kingsley. Kingsley saw it too. "There will be men who swear they never served him," he said softly. "And men who served him last night and will serve some other cruelty tomorrow if no one is there to stop them." Harry put a hand over the pocket where his wand rested, whole and warm. The silence within him shifted. Not less heavy, only shaped differently. Behind them, from inside the great hall, someone called his name in a cracked voice full of awe and gratitude. Harry shut his eyes for a second. When he opened them again, the sun had come over the trees, and the day, indifferent and unstoppable, had begun. The funerals were held 2 days later under a sky the color of old pewter. By then the worst of the rubble had been cleared from the entrance hall. The dead had names again instead of covered shapes, and the first owls had begun to come in such numbers that the teachers gave up trying to keep them from the windows. Every few minutes a bird blundered through the shattered light of the castle with another letter tied to its leg, another plea, another blessing, another demand. The world beyond the grounds had awakened and discovered it had not, in fact, ended. It seemed unable to decide whether to rejoice or tremble. Harry scarcely remembered most of those days. He remembered hours that seemed torn loose from ordinary time, sitting on the edge of a bed in the hospital wing while Madame Pomfrey rubbed a salve into the burn on his wrist and muttered that saving the world was no excuse for neglecting simple first aid. Finding Luna in a corridor with her shoes in her hands because she said she could not bear the sound of heels on stone just now. Standing in the doorway of an empty classroom wheeled. The memorial gathered everyone on the sloping lawn above the lake. Students stood shoulder to shoulder with ministry witches and wizards, villagers from Hogsmeade, members of the Order, families summoned from all over Britain. The wind worried the edges of black robes and sent the long grass hissing around the rows of white markers newly set into the earth. Dumbledore's tomb shone near the water like a piece of moon fallen out of the day. It seemed impossible to Harry that the dead of this battle should rest within sight of it, as if the castle were collecting its losses around the memory of the last man who had known all along what the cost would be. No speeches were grander than grief could bear. Minerva spoke first, her voice clear and iron-hard, naming courage without ornament. Then others stepped forward when they were able. Some said nothing at all, only touched a wand to a stone and stood with their heads bowed. When Molly tried to speak for Fred, the sound broke apart in her throat. Arthur caught her before she fell. Percy, white-faced, took the slip of parchment from her hand and could not read from it either. In the end, George went to the marker alone, put one hand on the cool white stone, and stood there until the wind turned savage and everyone else had begun to cry. His silence was so complete it became its own kind of testimony. For Remus and Tonks there was a smaller circle after the larger crowd had drifted away. Andromeda came with Teddy in her arms. The child was too young to understand any of it. He blinked solemnly at the gray afternoon, and in one bewildering instant, his sparse hair turned from mousy brown to a bright, impossible turquoise. It was the only moment that made several people smile. Harry stood a little apart, his hands cold despite the season. Andromeda's face might have been carved from old sorrow, but when she looked at Teddy, something in it softened without breaking. "He was hungry half an hour ago," she said quietly, because ordinary things still had to be said even on days like this. "He does not seem to care for memorials." Harry let out a breath that might once have become a laugh. Probably wise. She studied him with eyes so like her sister's that the old instinctive jolt ran through him, though there was nothing of Bellatrix in her expression. Only exhaustion and an intelligence sharpened by survival. "Remus told me you had agreed to be his godfather." Harry swallowed. "Yes. Then live long enough to keep your promise." There was no accusation in the words. That made them cut deeper. When the small gathering broke apart, Harry wandered down toward the lake and stopped near the reeds where the water lapped black and cold against the stones. The surface held the sky in it like tarnished metal. He wanted, with a childish fierceness that embarrassed him, to go somewhere no one knew him. Somewhere no one would look at him with relief so great it felt like an anchor on the throat. "I had wondered where you would bolt to," Ginny said. He had not heard her approach. She came to stand beside him, her morning robes whipped against her legs by the wind. The bruising under one eye had yellowed into green. It made her look to Harry, not fragile but battle-marked. "I wasn't bolting." She looked out across the lake. "You were doing the thing where you think if you stare hard enough at the horizon it might tell you what to do." He rubbed a thumb over the seam of his sleeve. "Has it ever worked?" "Not once." He looked at her then, really looked, and saw that grief sat in her too, layered and complex. Fred, the dead students, the night she had lost him and got him back, all of it bound up together. Yet her eyes were steady. "They're going to keep doing it," he said. Staring. "Yes. As if I know something they don't." "You do know something they don't," she said. "You know what it's like when the cheering stops and there's still a mess to clear up." Before he could answer, footsteps sounded behind them. Kingsley came down the slope without hurry, as if he had no wish to intrude and every intention of doing so anyway. "I'll leave you to your horizon," Ginny murmured, and brushed Harry's arm with her fingers as she passed. Kingsley stopped a few feet away. "My apologies." Harry shook his head. "There are discrepancies in the capture lists," Kingsley said without preamble. 3 men seen on the grounds during the battle never arrived in custody. 2 ministry clerks responsible for processing seized property have vanished from their posts. 1 evidence room was entered overnight. He looked out over the lake rather than at Harry. "Victories create shadows as well as light. Men slip into them." Harry felt anger rise, clean and hot, because he had not wanted to hear that yet, and because some part of him had known it before Kingsley spoke. "Then go after them." Kingsley's profile hardened. "I intend to." The wind came up off the water and shook the reeds. Behind them, the first mourners were leaving the graves, black shapes moving slowly against the white stones. Harry thought of Teddy in Andromeda's arms, of George with his hand on Fred's marker, of the way the world kept demanding one more thing after every sacrifice, as if suffering itself generated appetite. When Kingsley finally turned to him, there was something in his gaze more deliberate than condolence. "We'll speak soon," he said. Then he went up the slope toward the castle, leaving Harry with the lake, the graves, and the uneasy sense that the war had not ended so much as changed its clothes. The burrow had always seemed to Harry like a place that took the ordinary and made it magical simply by loving it hard enough. The sloping floors, the clutter of well-mended things, the smell of onions and wood smoke and baking bread, the ghoul in the attic rattling away above the rafters, all of it had once felt gloriously alive to him. Proof that home could be untidy and noisy and still hold. In the weeks after the battle, the house held differently. It did not fail, but it bent under the weight placed on it. Grief moved through its rooms, like a weather front. Some mornings it came as silence. Some mornings as fierce overfeeding. Once as Molly standing in the scullery with a dish towel in both hands, staring at the plate she had taken down for Fred before remembering, all over again, that she no longer needed it. Harry stayed there because there was nowhere else he wanted to be, and nowhere else he could easily disappear. Grimmauld Place stood empty and watchful in his mind, full of too many ghosts. Hogwarts was under repair. The Ministry sent owls daily. The Prophet sent 3 in one morning, each demanding an exclusive account. Ron suggested using them to line the chicken coop bar. Hermione suggested kindling. Ginny suggested setting them on fire and owling back the ashes. By the end of the first week, there were stacks of unopened letters on every spare surface. One paper had printed a sketch of Harry with a halo over his head. Another called him Britain's greatest living defender. Rita Skeeter had produced, with indecent speed, a column claiming that Harry's mysterious poise in the face of catastrophe proved he had been secretly groomed for command by Albus Dumbledore from infancy. Harry threw that one at the wall hard enough to knock a spoon off the dresser. "Bit flattering, that," Ron said from the table, where he was trying one-handed to butter toast while Hermione sorted mail into piles marked sensible, deranged, and needs reporting to law enforcement. "You're enjoying this," Harry said. Ron grinned without mirth. "I'm enjoying the part where somebody from Dorset has offered to name their crop puppies after us. We've made it." George sat at the far end of the kitchen with a mug between both hands and did not look up. That silenced the room more effectively than any rebuke. It was toward evening that Kingsley arrived. He did not apparate directly into the garden, perhaps out of courtesy to Molly, who disapproved of surprise entrances nearly as much as she disapproved of unannounced danger. Instead, there came a knock at the door, and Arthur let him in from the lane, where the twilight still held a faint wash of gold over the hedges. Kingsley seemed larger indoors, too full of the business of the outside world to fit easily under the low beams. Molly straightened at once, dish towel over one shoulder. "You'll have supper," she said, in the tone of a woman who believed not even ministers were exempt from being fed. "Gratefully," Kingsley said, but his gaze had already gone to Harry. Under his arm he carried a thick ministry file bound in dark red ribbon. The kitchen gradually settled into attention without anyone admitting to it. Hermione set down her letters. Ginny folded her arms. Ron wiped his fingers on a tea towel. Only George remained staring into his mug as if answers might still rise from the dregs. Kingsley waited until plates had been filled, and the first little domestic noises of serving and passing had calmed. Then he rested the file on the table. "I'll not waste anyone's time by pretending this is a social call," he said. "That's a pity," Ron muttered. "I was hoping you'd come for pudding." A brief flash of weary humor crossed Kingsley's face. "If this goes badly, perhaps I'll stay for 2 helpings." He untied the ribbon and opened the file. Harry saw forms, lists, statements, diagrams of wards, names he did not recognize and several he did. At once, the kitchen felt smaller. "The Department of Magical Law Enforcement is in pieces," Kingsley said. "Half from neglect, half from sabotage, half from the simple fact that mathematics gives up in wartime and bad times have a habit of producing extra halves. We have Aurors, dead, missing, or under suspicion of collaboration. We have seized properties not yet catalogued. We have men who fled the battle and are now being hidden by friends, cousins, debtors, or cowards. We also have a public that will not tolerate." "Then appoint more people," Hermione said, too quickly to sound entirely calm. "I am doing so." Kingsley looked at Harry, then at Ron. "The usual qualifications for Auror training will be waived under emergency authority," he said. "No final NEWTS, no waiting period. Immediate probationary induction under direct supervision of the Auror Office. I want both of you." The room did not so much fall silent as harden around the words. Molly made a small, strangled sound. Arthur put his hand over hers. Harry stared. "No? No. You can't be serious," Hermione said. "They've barely slept. They've survived," Kingsley interrupted, not sharply but with a weight that stopped her. And what they survived has made them useful in ways school examinations cannot measure. Useful, Molly repeated, as if the word itself were an obscenity. Kingsley's expression gentled. Molly, I know how this sounds. No, she said. No, you don't. For a moment, even he had no answer to that. Harry looked down at the open file. A list headed unaccounted for swam before his eyes. Somewhere on another page he caught the phrase evidence tampering. He thought of the men at the castle gates with their faces turned away. Why me? He asked. Besides the obvious. Kingsley held his gaze. Because you know the methods of the enemy better than anyone alive. Because you have repeatedly shown judgment under impossible conditions. Because you are difficult to coerce, impossible to buy, and resistant to a degree of magic that has ruined better people than most ministries can produce in a generation. He paused. And yes, because the public will trust an Auror Office in which Harry serves. I would insult you if I pretended politics had nothing to do with it. But I would insult the truth if I pretended politics were all. No. Ron leaned forward. If he goes, I go. Hermione shut her eyes briefly, as though summoning patience by force. Ginny said nothing at all. Her silence, Harry had learned, was never emptiness. It was a door closed while she decided what to do with what she felt. Kingsley retied the ribbon around the file. You need not answer tonight, but I will need an answer soon. He rose. Molly, out of sheer instinct and perhaps in defiance of everything larger than herself, thrust a bowl of treacle tart at him before he could escape. Harry watched Kingsley accept it with grave gratitude, and felt the shape of his own life shift a fraction, like a compass needle moved by an unseen magnet. Harry gave Kingsley his answer the next afternoon, but the decision was made before the words ever left his mouth. He had gone first to Andromeda's house with a tin of biscuits Molly insisted on sending, and a clumsy intention of checking whether she needed anything. The cottage stood quiet in a lane rimmed with hawthorn, all its windows open to the warm air. Inside, everything smelled faintly of lavender and new milk. There were photographs on the mantelpiece, some turned toward the room, some turned away. Harry did not know which arrangement hurt less. Andromeda took the biscuits with a nod that meant thank you without wasting either of them on ceremony. Teddy was in a cradle by the hearth, not asleep but solemnly engaged in the serious business of waving both fists at the canopy overhead. His hair was bubblegum pink today. When Harry bent over him, it faded at once to black, then to a startled yellow. He does that when strangers lean too close, Andromeda said. I'm not sure I count as a stranger. Then perhaps he simply disapproves of your glasses. Harry smiled despite himself. It was the first uncomplicated smile he had managed in days, and it made his face feel stiff. He sank into the chair opposite her while she lifted Teddy and settled him against her shoulder. She moved with the practiced steadiness of someone who had found in necessity a rhythm she never asked for. Kingsley has offered you work, she said after a time. Harry stared. Has everyone decided to become legilimens? No, only observant. Her mouth shifted. He sent a note this morning asking whether I thought it likely you would vanish if cornered. I replied that it depended on how politely he cornered you. Nay. Harry barked a short laugh, then sobered. I haven't said yes yet. No, Andromeda said. But you will. Teddy made a small, indignant noise. She rocked him once, and he subsided. Harry looked at the child's tiny hand gripping the collar of her robe. How do you know? Because I have seen men decide to fight for foolish reasons and for wise ones. You don't care enough about glory to do it for glory. You do care enough about the next child to do it for him. Harry looked up sharply, but she was still looking at Teddy. Remus, she said quietly, spent much of his life believing he made the world more dangerous simply by existing in it. He was wrong. The dangerous people were always the ones who made children grow up too quickly. Her fingers brushed Teddy's back. If you can help stop that, then stop it. If you cannot, do not go because other people require a symbol. Symbols are only useful to those who are not asked to live as them. When Harry left the cottage, the sky had gone pearl white with heat. He walked a long time before apparating, letting dust gather on his shoes, letting the countryside thin and vanish with the crack of magic. He arrived in the ministry atrium to find half the great hall scaffolded, the old fountain still absent, its place occupied by stacked crates and a ring of charmed barriers. The polished grandeur he remembered from his hearings and disasters had been stripped back to something rawer. Clerks moved quickly under floating lamps. A team from magical maintenance repaired a section of blackened stone while two hit wizards argued over ward strengthening near the security desk. Everywhere there was the feeling of a machine being rebuilt while its wheels still turned. People saw him at once. Some pretended not to. Others failed entirely. Kingsley met him near the lifts, as if he had known to the minute when Harry would come. "You've decided." "Yes." It felt strange how little ceremony the word required. "Good." Kingsley did not smile, but relief crossed his face. "You'll report to level 2. They rode down in a lift that smelled of hot metal and parchment. Harry watched the numbers burn past and felt his stomach tighten the way it used to before Quidditch matches. Level 2 opened onto a corridor where harried witches strode with armfuls of files and doors banged every few seconds. At the far end, a frosted glass panel read Auror Office. Someone had tried to clean soot from the letters and only smeared it further. Inside, the room was larger than Harry expected, and far less dramatic than the stories made it seem. No row of heroes in gleaming coats. No hush of elite mystery. Just desks, maps, cabinets, evidence shelves, an enchanted board of moving names and locations, and the particular fatigue of people who had been overworked for too long to care what legends thought of them. Gawain stood beside a desk with both hands on its scarred surface. He was broad in the shoulder, sandy-haired, gone iron at the temples, with an old white line running from one ear into his collar. His eyes were the eyes of a man difficult to impress and impossible to fool. "So," he said, "the celebrity has arrived." Harry opened his mouth, uncertain whether there was a correct answer to that. Gawain spared him. "If you're looking for hero worship, Potter, the Department of Magical Games and Sports is upstairs. We have no use for it here." Kingsley leaned against the desk, arms folded. "We have use for his answer to the offer." Harry held Gawain's gaze. "Yes." Something like approval flickered and was gone. Gawain pulled open a drawer and withdrew a small leather folder and a plain silver badge no larger than Harry's palm, engraved with the ministry seal and a single stamped word beneath it: probationary. "This gets you through restricted doors and precisely nowhere else if I can help it," Gawain said. "You are not a mascot. You are not a press ornament. You are not here because of your scar. You are here because the minister has lost whatever little sense wartime left him, and because, if I am very fortunate, you might justify his lapse." Harry took the badge. It was cool and heavier than it looked. "The law," Gawain said, sliding the leather folder across the desk, "is not a duel. You don't get to win by being quicker on the draw and call it justice. You will learn procedure, evidence handling, arrest protocol, interview rules, wand registration, magical restraint classifications, and how not to wreck a crime scene because somebody insults you. You will. Harry tucked the badge into his pocket. "Training starts at 6, Gawain said. "If you're late, I shall assume fame has made your clock unreliable." Kingsley pushed away from the desk. "Welcome to the office, Harry." The word welcome landed strangely. It sounded less like comfort than enlistment. Still, as Harry looked around the scarred room with its maps and lists and weary people who had no time for mythology, he felt something in him settle. Not peace. Never that. Something sterner. Something with work in it. Auror training, Harry discovered almost immediately, had less in common with legend than with punishment. The first morning began before sunrise in a chamber lined with runes, shock-absorbent stone, and the sort of wards that made the air feel faintly metallic on the tongue. Gawain was already there when Harry arrived, coat off, shirt sleeves rolled, reading from a clipboard while two older trainees stretched in silence nearby. One looked Harry over with open skepticism, the other with a sort of resigned curiosity, as if she had expected celebrity to be taller. 5 laps, Gawain said without greeting. Then shielding drills. Harry, who had imagined dueling and pursuit and perhaps some kind of elite competence from the start, said, "Laps? If that noun is troubling, we can rename them heroic circuits." By the end of the 3rd circuit, Harry would have accepted almost any name so long as it meant stopping. The chamber seemed to lengthen maliciously each time he turned. After shielding came falls. After falls came disarming sequences. After disarming came lectures delivered by a witch from the improper use of Magic Office, who spoke for 40 uninterrupted minutes on warrant scope and chain of custody, while Harry's legs slowly forgot their own function. Then there were identification exercises. Cursed artifacts laid out under glass, some subtle as jewelry, some nasty-looking enough to be obvious even to a first year. Gawain rejected quick answers with brutal calm. "It looks dark," Harry said of a silver comb that hissed faintly when approached. "So does my expression, and yet it is not illegal." Details. By the 3rd day, he had learned that battle instinct and law enforcement instinct ran on different tracks. In battle, the point was survival. In Auror work, the point was control. You did not blast a room to rubble because someone might be hiding in it. You secured exits, identified witnesses, preserved evidence, and tried, insofar as circumstances allowed, to bring suspects in breathing. That last part lodged like a splinter. Harry had spent a year hunting people whose deaths had often seemed like a practical necessity. Now Gawain lectured him on measured force and post-arrest rights with the severity of a man teaching arithmetic to a large dog. Ron appeared on the 4th morning with his hair standing up in 7 directions and his shirt half untucked, carrying a folder identical to Harry's and looking so affrontedly awake that Harry nearly laughed for the first time in days. "Told you," Ron said, dropping onto the bench beside him. "If you're going to make catastrophic life choices, I'm having a go as well." "You're late," Gawain said. Ron blinked at him. Only emotionally. Gawain stared for a beat, then pointed at the track. "Run until that becomes less true." Ron muttered something unprintable and set off. Having Ron there changed the temperature of the work. Not easier, nothing was easy, but recognizable. They exchanged grimaces over case law, snatched sandwiches between lectures, and lost a small but meaningful war against the amount of parchment an Auror was expected to produce after any event more complicated than tripping over a Kneasel. Harry would have sworn he had not seen so many forms even during Umbridge's reign. Gawain, when told this, said, "That is because Umbridge preferred tyranny to documentation." The chamber duels were worst and best together. Harry's body understood combat before his mind could finish objecting. Under pressure, he moved with a speed and economy that made the older trainees stop smirking. In one drill, he disarmed a man nearly twice his size before the whistle had fully blown. In another, he shielded Ron and deflected a stunner into a target rune so cleanly that even Gawain grunted. Then a trainee opposite him cast a practice curse that flared green by some accident of reflected light, and the world narrowed to a single color. For one humiliating second, Harry could not breathe. The chamber vanished. The forest came back, and the body falling, and his own helpless certainty that he had walked at last toward death exactly as intended. The curse slammed into his shield and splashed harmless sparks across the floor. Harry heard someone shout his name from very far away. He forced his fingers tighter around his wand and dropped into stance again, but his hands were shaking. Gawain called the halt. The other trainee stepped back without looking at him too directly. Harry expected a reprimand. Instead, Gawain said, "Again." Harry stared. "Again," Gawain repeated. "Fear is information. Panic is bad filing. Sort it properly." So they did it again. And again. Not until Harry ceased flinching, because perhaps he never entirely would, but until the motion of lifting a shield could live in his muscles alongside memory instead of beneath it. At the end of that day, Hermione met them in the atrium with 2 overstuffed satchels, and the stern look of a witch who had spent too long in flourish and blots. She was returning to Hogwarts in autumn, she told them. She would finish properly if the world ended again for having waited 1 year to do it. Then so be it. But meanwhile, she had bought them texts on magical jurisprudence, evidence charm theory, and a pocket guide to interrogation pitfalls. Ron took the smallest book, flipped it open, and groaned. There are footnotes. There are lives attached to those footnotes, Hermione said. Harry looked from the books to his probationary badge in his hand, and thought that for the first time since the battle, he could feel the future arriving in pieces small enough to carry. The first time Gawain led Harry near an active file, he did it with the expression of a man conceding a point to gravity. "Read," he said, dropping a stack of folders onto the desk Harry shared with Ron. "Do not infer, embellish, dramatize, or go herring off after a hunch unless I approve the herring first." Ron opened the top folder. "How does one herring responsibly? By keeping your mouth shut and your notes legible." It was late enough that the Auror Office had taken on the peculiar intimacy of overwork. Most of the clerks had gone. Lamps burned low over clusters of desks. Beyond the windows, London was only darkness and scattered lights. The city turned abstract by rain. Harry had already discovered that the ministry after hours felt less like the seat of government than the backstage of a vast, untidy theater, where exhausted people in shirt sleeves tried to keep the illusion running. The files concerned post-battle seizures, missing persons, and irregularities in property intake. It sounded dull on paper. It was not dull at all. Some of the seized items were merely pathetic: cheap silver rings engraved with slogans, imitation dark artifacts sold to frightened families who wanted a little insurance from whatever tyrant came next. Some were genuinely dangerous: cursed lockets, blood-sealed parchments, a music box from Wiltshire that drove listeners toward violent confession after 2 minutes and 40 seconds. More worrying were the absences. 3 crates logged at a temporary holding site had arrived at the ministry under guard and been entered into the overnight ledger. By morning, 1 crate had vanished along with the clerk responsible for signing it in. A second clerk who should have reported the discrepancy had not turned up for work since. Both homes were empty. Both fireplaces cold. Both neighbors suddenly very eager to say they had seen nothing at all. Harry turned another page. Inside was an inventory of the missing crate: 1 packet of confiscated ministry access tokens, 2 charmed quills used for forged authorizations, 1 box of obsolete but still functional transport seals, and a ledger written in disappearing ink recovered from a safe house in Birmingham. The notation beside the ledger read, "Refer to spell damage recovery." Beside that, in newer ink, item absent on recheck. "It's not random," Harry said. Gawain, who had been annotating a report nearby, did not look up. Most crimes are not random. They are lazy, greedy, or stupid. Occasionally they are organized. Which flavor are you tasting? Mamba. Oh. Harry tapped the page. "This lot. They're not taking gold or easy valuables. They're taking access." Ron leaned in. "And paperwork tools. That's either the most boring criminal gang in history or the cleverest." Harry spread 3 lists side by side. "Here, the missing clerk at the holding site, the other missing clerk, and the family name of a wizard seen fleeing the grounds after the battle but not caught." He pointed to each in turn. "All from the same part of the country, North Yorkshire." Ron frowned. "That means they all like sheep." "It means," Harry said, "they might know one another." Gawain finally rose and came to stand over them. He smelled faintly of stale tea and spell smoke. "You think there's a retrieval effort?" "I think," Harry said carefully, "someone's gathering whatever survived." Gawain bent over the pages. For a long moment, the only sound was rain ticking the windows and the scratch of a quill somewhere down the room. Then Kingsley appeared in the doorway, as if the hour itself had summoned him. His robes were damp at the shoulders. "Tell me," Harry repeated it. Kingsley listened without interruption, 1 hand on the doorframe. When he heard the list of missing items, his face went still. "The tokens matter," Kingsley said quietly. "With the right alterations, they could open old ministry compartments and certain restricted archives, not everywhere. Enough places. Could be opportunists, Gawain said. Could, Kingsley agreed. Could also be someone reconstructing a network. The word network made the room seem colder. Harry looked down at the disappearing ink ledger note. Can the spell damage be reversed? Perhaps, Gawain said. Given time. Kingsley's gaze sharpened on Harry. And until then we assume every step we take is being watched by whoever removed that crate. Harry felt the old alertness rise in him, not wild as it had been during the hunt, but narrower, more disciplined. So we stop looking official. Gawain crossed his arms. You volunteering yourself? If someone at the ministry is leaking information, a formal sweep will scare them off. But a quiet question in the right place will get you killed if you mistake bravado for skill, Gawain said. Ron cleared his throat. He won't, because I'll be there to supply the bravado and he can concentrate on the skill. No. Kingsley's mouth twitched despite the tension. He looked from one to the other and then back to the files. There's an apothecary in Diagon Alley flagged last winter for unusual orders placed through intermediaries, he said. Nothing enough for arrest. Enough for notice. 2 of the names tied to the missing clerks overlap with his customer records. Gawain made a low, dissatisfied sound that Harry was beginning to recognize as consent in rough clothing. Tomorrow, Gawain said, you go with Savage. You ask questions, you observe, and you do precisely nothing theatrical. If anyone so much as sneezes suspiciously, you notify the office before playing hero. Are we understood? Nah. Harry met his eyes. Understood. The rain thickened against the windows. Somewhere deep in the ministry, a clock struck midnight. Harry looked at the scattered files, the absences and stolen permissions and quiet erasures, and knew with a certainty colder than fear that Voldemort's fall had not ended appetite. It had only left scraps for other hands to gather. Diagon Alley in wartime had always seemed to Harry like a stage set missing its actors. Post-war Diagon Alley was stranger. The shops were open. Cauldrons shone in windows. Owls hooted from elops. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves for sugar quills and starter wands. Yet everything moved with the wariness of people crossing thin ice. Laughter died quickly. Every loud crack of apparition made 3 heads turn. Prosperity had not returned, only commerce, which was a different and less generous thing. Savage met them near the leaky cauldron at 10 in the morning. He was a narrow-faced Auror, with a tired mustache and the sort of quiet eyes that missed very little. Harry had seen him in the office without speaking to him. Today he wore plain dark robes and a cloak too shabby to mark him as ministry at first glance. Minister says you're useful, Savage said by way of greeting. Robbard says you're a complication. I shall proceed on the assumption that both are true. Ron seemed delighted by this. That's about the nicest thing anyone said all week. They moved through the alley without drawing too much notice, though Harry was uncomfortably aware that some people recognized him anyway. A girl outside Madame Malkin's nudged her mother and stared until they passed. A goblin at Gringotts looked straight through him with immaculate disdain. Savage took them not to the flagged apothecary first, but to 3 smaller shops in a row, a stationer, a cauldron polisher, and a little establishment selling bottled draft bases and common potion ingredients. At each he asked ordinary questions in an ordinary voice, accumulating fragments like a man building a wall from loose stone. By the time they reached the apothecary at the far end of the street, Harry understood why Gawain trusted him. Savage did not bully. He simply stood in a room long enough for lies to wilt. The apothecary itself was dim and cool, lined floor to ceiling with jars whose contents floated, curled, settled, or pulsed in murky suspension. The shopkeeper was a sallow wizard with clean nails and the practiced politeness of someone who preferred customers not to linger. He greeted Savage with cautious recognition, and Harry with immediate, sharpened alarm before he could hide it. "We're just asking about customer records," Savage said. "Routine." "I've already spoken to ministry representatives," the man replied. "Then you'll have no objection to doing so again." The exchange might have gone nowhere. Perhaps it would have, had Harry not noticed the wizard's right sleeve snagging every time he reached for the ledger on the counter. There was something stiff sewn into the cuff, not a wand holster. Paper. Guy. The man saw Harry glance at it and folded his arms at once. "We're very busy," he said. Savage continued in his mild voice. "You have had 7 customers in the last hour. Very busy for August." Ron snorted and then coughed to cover it. The wizard's eyes flickered toward the door. Harry felt the moment tip. He did not know exactly why he spoke, only that he heard the strain in the man's breathing and recognized it. "No one's asking you to die for anyone," Harry said. Savage shot him a warning look, but Harry went on. "If you're covering for people who served him, they won't thank you for it. They won't save you either." The wizard's mouth tightened. "I serve no one." "I didn't say you did." Harry took one step closer to the counter. "But you're afraid. So either you're guilty, or you know someone who is. And if you know, then you also know this doesn't end because one man fell in a courtyard." For a second, the man's face became nakedly tired. It was not innocence, and it was not hardened malice either. Something smaller, meaner, more ordinary. Complicity worn as long habit. He looked at Savage, not at Harry. "I rent storage," he muttered. "Upstairs. Sometimes. To men who pay well and ask for privacy." Savage's expression did not change. "Names. I don't know them." "Descriptions, then." The wizard swallowed. "One with a burn scar by the ear. One woman, hooded most times, left-handed. They came last night. They'll come tonight too, I think." His gaze jerked toward the stair at the back. "They used the room above the old candlemaker. There was a note." Savage took the cuff in a single smooth motion and shook loose a folded scrap of parchment. The wax seal had been broken, but not cleanly. 3 black strokes crossed a circle, simple and ugly as claw marks. Ron peered at it. "Cheery." Savage tucked it away. "Show us." The room above the deserted candlemaker smelled of dust, tallow, and old rain seeping through stone. A table, 2 chairs, 1 extinguished lantern, nothing else. Yet on the floor near the skirting board, Harry saw a chalk mark half wiped away. The same 3 strokes and circle. Not random, then. Deliberate. He crouched. The chalk came away faintly on his finger. From the window overlooking the alley came a sudden scrape. Harry spun, wand out. A shadow vanished past the glass. He was moving before anyone could stop him, down the narrow stair, into the lane behind the shops, through a wash of heat and refuse smell and startled cats. A figure in a dark cloak darted around the corner ahead, lean and quick. Harry followed, heart kicking hard, every lesson on procedure struggling against the older, fiercer instinct that said, "Run now, ask later." He nearly caught the stranger by the old sign for Twilfit and Tadding's delivery yard. Nearly. A hex flashed back over the shoulder, red, not green, and Harry threw himself aside as brick burst beside his head. By the time he regained his feet, the alley beyond was empty except for a rained-on barrel and a child's dropped hoop. Savage arrived moments later, breathing only slightly harder than before. He looked at the shattered brick and then at Harry. "You were told," he said, very quietly, "not to do anything theatrical." Harry lowered his wand. "Sorry." Savage stared 1 second longer. Then, to Harry's surprise, he said, "Good reflex on the dodge. Terrible judgment on the chase." "No." Ron came pelting up behind them, red-faced. "Did we get whoever it was?" "No," Harry said. Savage's gaze went to the broken wax seal in his pocket, then back to the empty alley. "Not yet. But tonight," he said, "we may get someone who believes we haven't found the room." Rain began shortly after dusk and settled over London with stubborn intent. By the time Harry, Ron, and Savage took their positions in Knockturn Alley, the cobbles shone like oil and every doorway dripped. The abandoned candlemaker's shop crouched between a shuttered junk dealer and a pawn shop whose sign creaked in the wind. Across the alley, a single lantern burned behind grimy glass, turning the rain gold for a few feet and black everywhere else. Gawain had wanted a larger team. Savage had argued correctly that a larger team meant more visible preparation and greater risk of spooking the buyers. In the end, they compromised badly, as compromises often do. 4 Aurors instead of 8, concealed by layered disillusionment and a brace of muffling wards, with backup positioned a street away. Harry had received those instructions from Gawain in a voice so clipped it seemed each syllable might have drawn blood on the way out. "If the suspect runs," Gawain had said, "you do not pursue past the boundary marker unless Savage orders it. If a fight breaks, you prioritize capture and evidence. If you improvise, I shall personally see to it that your next 6 months consist entirely of filing cabinets and anti-jinx cataloging." Bah. Now, damp to the knees and breathing the mixed stink of wet stone, old smoke, and something rotten in a nearby drain, Harry repeated the rules silently to himself. Beside him, under the arch of a recessed doorway, Ron shifted his grip on his wand and mouthed, filing cabinets with a look of comic terror. Harry almost smiled. Then footsteps sounded. 3 figures emerged from the far end of the alley, all cloaked, all moving with the brisk economy of people accustomed to dangerous meetings. One carried a crate levitating at shoulder height beneath a stabilizing charm. Another kept a wand already in hand. The third walked slightly ahead, hood low, posture light, and quick. Leader, Harry thought at once. Or lookout. They stopped at the candlemaker's entrance. The levitating crate dipped as the largest of them drew a key from his sleeve. Rain rattled off the eaves. Somewhere down the alley a cat gave a raw, complaining yowl. Savage's signal came as a small pulse against Harry's wrist where the linked charm had been fixed. Wait. The key touched the lock. Savage stepped out of invisibility like a blade leaving a sheath. "Ministry of Magic," he snapped. "Wands down." For one suspended fraction of time, no one moved. Then everything moved. The leader spun with startling speed and fired a curse that split the lantern glass across the alley. Darkness lunged in. Harry's shield came up on instinct as red light crashed against it hard enough to jar his arm to the shoulder. Ron shouted, "Expelliarmus!" from somewhere to the left. Savage was already driving the largest suspect backward with a sequence of tight, controlled stunners that forced him into defense instead of flight. The witch with the crate dropped it and slashed a curse low. The cobbles where Harry had been a second before burst apart in a spray of stone. He hit the ground, rolled, and came up on one knee behind the shelter of a rain barrel. "Protego!" A second curse broke over his shield in silver sparks. The leader was moving not toward escape, but toward the fallen crate. That, more than anything, fixed Harry's attention. Not panic, then. Not an ordinary criminal scramble. Whatever was inside mattered more than leaving. Ron darted across Harry's line of sight, soaked hair plastered to his forehead, and sent a well-placed jinx that tangled the largest suspect's legs. Savage capitalized instantly, binding the man in a whip-fast cord that hauled his arms to his sides. The witch by the crate hissed something Harry did not catch and aimed at Ron. Harry saw the angle of breath before the spell left her wand. "Down!" Ron dropped flat. Harry's disarming charm hit her wrist with enough force to send the wand skidding across the wet stones. She lunged after it anyway with a kind of desperate, feral fury that made him think not of fanaticism but of orders. He cast Incarcerus. Ropes slammed around her torso and pinned her to the ground, splashing filthy water up her sleeves. The leader had reached the crate, not opening it, protecting it. One gloved hand flashed over the lid in a charm pattern Harry recognized from the evidence room lectures. Tamper seal. Destroy contents if moved. "Harry!" Savage barked. Harry did not think. He cast a binding hex at the leader's wand arm and, in the same motion, drove himself forward through the rain. The hex connected. The wand flew sideways. The leader turned, and for an instant Harry saw only a pale mouth beneath the hood and eyes bright with something colder than fear. A knife appeared in the leader's free hand. Not everything in the wizarding world required a wand. The blade came in low and fast. Harry twisted aside, felt cloth tear along his ribs, and smashed his shoulder into the suspect's chest with enough force to send them both sprawling against the crate. Rainwater and mud soaked through at once. The knife clattered away. Petrificus totalis! The spell struck from very near. Ron's voice, Ron's aim. The leader's body locked rigid. Silence did not return at once. It flooded in around hard breathing, dripping eaves, the moan of the captured witch trying uselessly to work her ropes loose. Savage stood over the bound man with his wand steady, rain running off the end of his nose. Another Auror came pelting up from the alley mouth, late but welcome. Harry pushed himself upright. His side burned where the knife had sliced his shirt, but the skin beneath felt only grazed. He looked down at the crate. The tamper seal still glimmered faintly blue over the lid. "You all right?" Ron demanded. "Yes." Harry swallowed rain. "The crate." Savage crouched, examined the seal, and let out a breath. "Intact." He looked up. "You saw it too. They were willing to leave a man and a woman, but not the contents." The leader lay petrified at Harry's feet, rain beating on the edge of the hood. Harry stared down and thought of Gawain's lecture. Capture and evidence. Not chase. Not glory. The old Harry, the hunted one, the boy forged in improvisation and panic, would have gone after the fleeing shadow, would have left the crate for later and trusted instinct to justify the choice. Tonight, he had not. Something about that fact steadied him more than victory would have done. Savage rose. "Well, Potter," he said, not unkindly, "you've managed, against expectation, not to ruin the operation." Ron grinned through the rain. "High praise." Savage's mouth twitched. "Don't let it go to your head. We still need to know what they were carrying and who taught them Ministry Tamper Protocol." "None." Harry looked at the blue-sealed crate, the bound prisoners, the knife in the gutter, and felt the night open forward in a new direction. The battle at Hogwarts had been a storm, terrible and final. This was different. This was a hand feeling carefully for the latch of a door someone else had locked from the inside. The crate contained exactly the sort of things that made sensible people lose sleep. Once the tamper seal had been dismantled, carefully, by a curse breaker summoned from another department at a price of much muttering, the lid lifted to reveal padded compartments packed with ministry access tokens, forged transit permits, 3 sealed evidence bags bearing old confiscation numbers, and the vanished ledger from Birmingham, now stabilized under a preserving chart. At the bottom lay a small brass tube engraved with ward coordinates. Gawain stared at it for a full 5 seconds before saying, very softly, "Well, that's ugly." Harry, still damp and stitched along the cut in his shirt by an irritated healer, leaned over the table. "What is it?" "An anchor key," Kingsley said. "Old model. Department issue, retired years ago. With the right companion seal, it can lock onto internal ministry ward points. Not enough to take the whole building. Enough to open passages very few people remember are still there." Ron whistled. The prisoners were separated at once. The largest man turned out to be a petty smuggler with a history of selling whatever happened not to belong to him. He insisted he had been hired blind for transport. The witch refused her name for 40 minutes and then gave 3 different ones in succession, each less convincing than the last. The leader, once the hood had been pulled back, proved to be a narrow-faced wizard in his 30s with the pale, sleepless look of someone sustained by conviction after comfort had long since failed him. He would not speak at all until confronted with the contents of the crate. Then he smiled, and the smile was worse than any shouting. Harry was not permitted in the interrogation room itself, which grated more than he had expected. Gawain reminded him that probationary status and bruised ribs did not confer authority. So Harry waited in the corridor outside with Ron and a cup of stewed tea gone cold in his hands, listening to muffled voices through the heavy door and trying not to pace. It was past 1 in the morning when Kingsley emerged. The corridor lamps threw hollows under his eyes. Gawain followed a moment later. looking as though someone had personally offended him by confirming his suspicions. "Well?" Harry said. Kingsley glanced at the closed door behind him. "He says the Dark Lord was too theatrical." Ron blinked. "That's his defense." "No," Gawain said. "That's his creed." Harry set the tea down untouched. Kingsley leaned one shoulder against the wall. "He claims there are others rebuilding from what remains. Not a resurrection. A correction. Smaller cells. Less display. More infiltration. Old blood prejudices. New bureaucratic methods. He named no superior, but he used a title once and tried to swallow it afterward." "What title?" Harry asked. Kingsley's eyes rested on him. "The Regent." The word settled coldly. It sounded less like a name than an office waiting to be filled. Ron folded his arms. "I hate that already." "So do I," Gawain said. "People who title themselves are always more trouble than people who merely murder." Before Harry could ask anything else, Hermione hurried down the corridor, carrying a book almost as large as her torso and the broken wax seal in a preserving envelope. She had been hauled from bed by Owl half an hour earlier and looked furious enough about it to set the book on fire out of principle. Her hair was bundled into something that had given up trying to be a knot. "I found it," she said, slightly breathless. "Or something close. The mark." Gawain opened a nearby office and waved them all inside. The room smelled of dust and old paper. Hermione spread the book on the desk, turned pages with ruthless speed, and stabbed at an illustration in the margin. "There," she said. The symbol was nearly identical, 3 dark strokes crossing a circle. Under it ran a paragraph in crabbed script. "It's older than the last war," Hermione said. 18th century, maybe earlier as a variation. It was used by a reactionary faction inside the old magical administration during periods of panic about Muggle influence and legal reform. Not official exactly, more like a private alignment marker. The text associates it with the word regency in the sense of governing on behalf of a weakened order until proper authority can be restored. Ron stared. "You're telling me they're organized snobs with stationery?" Hermione gave him a look. "I'm telling you ideas survive leaders if no one uproots them." Kingsley's face had gone very still. "Then we have not merely scavengers. We have doctrine." Gawain turned to Harry. "And you brought us the first live thread." The words did not feel flattering. They felt like the click of a lock. Kingsley reached into his robes and withdrew a folded parchment sealed with the ministry crest. He held it a moment before offering it to Harry. "What's that?" Harry asked. "Your field assessment and provisional appointment papers," Kingsley said. "After tonight, I see no purpose in pretending your induction remains hypothetical." Harry took the parchment. His fingers, for reasons he could not entirely explain, felt suddenly clumsy. Gawain exhaled through his nose. "Do not mistake this for a declaration that you know what you're doing." "I won't." "Good," Gawain said. "Because you don't. But you made the correct decision in the alley. You prioritized the crate and the arrest over the chase. That is Auror judgment, not battlefield impulse." "Really?" Something warm and complicated moved through Harry at that. Not pride exactly, but the beginning of a belief that he might become equal to the work asked of him. Ron craned to read the parchment upside down. "Does it say youngest in history anywhere? Because the prophet's going to put it in letters the size of Hagrid." "As if that's a recommendation," Hermione said. Kingsley's mouth curved, tired but real. The formal wording is more restrained. The fact itself, unfortunately, remains true. Guy. Harry looked down at the parchment, at the careful official hand recording what the last month had made of him. Outside the small office window, London lay black and sleepless. Inside, under lamplight and old books and the shadow of a new enemy's name, his life tipped again. They swore him in just before dawn. Not in a grand chamber, not before the Wisengamot in full plumage, not with fanfare or trumpets or any of the nonsense the papers would later invent. Gawain did not believe in spectacle, and Kingsley, for all his understanding of public symbols, was too tired for theater at 5 in the morning. The ceremony took place in the minister's office with the curtains half open to a paling sky, a pot of strong tea cooling on the sideboard, and stacks of neglected dispatches rising from every flat surface like miniature fortresses of administrative despair. Ron stood beside Harry in a borrowed clean shirt, looking as though he had been dragged backward through the night and barely put together again in time. Hermione was there too, arms folded tightly, shadows under her eyes, the broken sealed book still clutched under one elbow, because she had apparently decided sleep was for societies not currently fending off ideological resurgence. Gawain occupied the hearthrug like a man waiting for paperwork to betray him. Kingsley stood behind the desk with a small velvet case open before him. "Raise your wand," he said. Harry did. The oath was older than he expected. Its language had edges worn smooth by use, but the meaning remained hard. To uphold magical law without fear or favor. To protect the vulnerable from unlawful harm. To use force only where necessary, and no further than necessity allowed. To place the safety of the many above ambition, vanity, prejudice, and private revenge. There was a line about resisting corruption of coin, kinship, coercion, or creed that made Hermione nod sharply, as if she approved of the drafting. There was another about bearing witness to truth even where truth diminished power. That one struck Harry more deeply than the rest. When he repeated the final words, the silver badge in Kingsley's hand warmed and gave off a brief, clean light. Magic sealed the promise. Not dramatic magic. No thunder. No choir of ghosts. Only the precise acknowledgement of an office old enough to have outlived many of the men who had dishonored it. Kingsley placed the badge in Harry's palm. It was different from the probationary token. Heavier. Sharper at the edges. On its face, the enchanted letter stood above the ministry seal, and beneath it in tiny script ran his name and status. Junior Auror, emergency appointment. "For the record," Kingsley said, "this appointment remains subject to continuing oversight, remedial education, and Robart's limitless appetite for criticism." Gawain inclined his head. At last, some proper language. Kingsley's gaze held Harry's. "Also for the record, you are the youngest wizard ever inducted into the office." Ron let out a low whistle. "There it is." Harry closed his fingers around the badge. It felt less like honor than weight. Not crushing weight. Chosen weight. The kind a person lifted because refusing it would mean leaving it for someone else, less able or less willing. Kingsley turned to Ron and repeated the oath, while Harry stepped back toward the window. Outside, dawn had reached the rooftops of London and turned them the color of pewter warming to silver. The city looked almost peaceful from that height. He knew better now than to trust the look of things. When the formalities were over, Hermione came to him first. She took one look at the badge, and then at his face, and whatever argument she had meant to make changed shape before reaching her mouth. "You know this doesn't make you invincible," she said. "I know. It doesn't even make you sensible." He laughed under his breath. "That's what Gawain keeps telling me." Her expression softened. "Be better at the paperwork than you were at school essays. Lives really do attach to it here." "Nay, Camille. I'll try." Ron, pinning his own badge crookedly to his shirt, said, "If I die because Harry files something alphabetically instead of chronologically, I'll haunt him." "You'll haunt me anyway," Harry said. True. When they stepped back into the atrium, the first owls of the morning were already arriving in a flurry around the public notice board. One dropped an early edition of the Daily Prophet at the feet of a yawning security wizard. The paper unfolded itself helpfully on the polished floor. Even from several yards away, Harry saw his own photograph moving on the front page. Serious and dark-eyed beneath a headline so large, it might have been trying to substitute size for wisdom. "Boy who lived becomes youngest Auror in history." Ron groaned. I'd almost begun to miss being anonymous. Ginny was waiting near the fountain site where the old statues had once stood. She had arrived sometime during the oath, and characteristically had not interrupted. Morning light found copper in her hair and made it fierce. When Harry came to her, she looked at the badge once, and then at the cut in his shirt, already repaired. "So," she said, "you chose the work." He nodded. "Good." That was all at first. Then she reached up, straightened his collar with 2 brisk fingers, and rested her hand against his chest for 1 heartbeat over the new badge. Her gaze was clear and unflinching. "Do not let them turn you into a story again," she said. "Stories are useful to people who aren't the ones bleeding inside them." Harry looked at her, at the scarlet gold light gathering in the broken heart of the ministry, at the clerks beginning another day, at the wandering owls and the yawning guards and the city waiting above them all. He thought of the great hall, the graves by the lake, Teddy's hair changing color in Andromeda's arms, George standing silent before Fred's stone, the rain in Knockturn Alley, the cold word Regent spoken outside an interrogation room. He thought of all the men who would call cruelty order if it let them sleep well in their own importance. Then he looked down at the case file Savage was bringing across the atrium at a sharp, urgent stride. "Too late for that," Harry said softly, "but I can decide what sort of story it is." Savage reached them and handed over the file without ceremony. On the front, in fresh black ink, was a new report. Attempted break-in at a sealed ministry archive. 1 guard cursed. Suspect escaped. 3-stroke symbol found at the scene. Harry tucked the prophet under one arm without opening it. With the other hand, he took the file. The badge on his chest felt cold, then steady. When he turned toward the lifts, no one called him the Chosen One. They called him Auror, and this time he did not look back.